Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the 2025 North America Career Week. My name is Melissa Venable, NCDA Professional Development Director, and I will be your virtual event MC for today. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our event moderator, Dr. Candy Ho.
Hello, everybody. Happy Career Month 2025. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're so delighted because this is a time to recognize, celebrate all the incredible work that's being done across the world, across, the entire planet for our field. So really excited to be here with you all. A little bit about me. I'm the Chancellor's Chair at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. And of course, current board member of CERIC and loyal fans of NCDA and CCDF. And I get to be your moderator today. And it's such an honor to be here with you all and with our esteemed panelists. I'm a first generation immigrant and an invited guest, and I'm joining you today from the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I reside at Simon Fraser University, Burnaby Mountain, and it's a place for historically for Indigenous people to gather for hunting and harvesting season, where they meet and talk about their plans for the year. And I feel like it's very similar. What we're going to be talking about today is how are we going to move our sector, the work that we do day in and day out forward. A big thank you to our wonderful panelists. You're going to hear from Janet, Shelby, Wendy, Tristram, and Sharon. Their bios are already on the website that you register with, and big thank you. Each of them hold tremendous expertise and knowledge in the field, and I'm really excited and I want to maximize the time to hear from them. So just a overview, we've got 5 big questions on really big topics ranging from decent work, mental health, AI and automation, youth employment, and then inclusive entrepreneurship. And then at the very end, we're going to wrap it up and get everybody to tell us, what are the steps that we can all take individually, collectively to advocate for the people and the communities that we serve. Okay, and so let's move on. The first theme here is decent work in a cost of living crisis. So the question I have for 2 panelists, I'm going to invite Janet and Tristram to share their perspectives. So the question is this: in a high cost of living context, what are the most dignifying ways to support short-term stability while building long-term mobility? And what should we champion at practice, organizational, and policy levels to make it stick? It is a mouthful, so it's going to be posted in the chat there. Janet, can I invite you to kick us off?
Yes, thank you, Candy, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Well, in today's high cost of living environment, I think the question is, how do we help people stay afloat right now while still creating the conditions for long-term mobility? And how do we do it in a way that protects dignity at every step? For me, dignity begins with reducing the burden on people. When someone is choosing between rent, food, and transportation, adding layers of paperwork or rigid program rules for only compound stress. So an example here is in British Columbia, Canada, our minimum wage is $17.85 per hour. Yet the living wages in the various communities throughout the province range from $21.55 to $29.60 per hour. And that gap means that even people who are working full time are struggling to meet basic needs. In that context, short-term stability is best supported when we give people what they really need, which is quickly flexible financial supports, faster program entry, navigation that doesn't require them to retell their stories over and over. Dignity means meeting people as whole human beings and not as a set of eligibility criteria. So, and when we ask people what they want and what they need, they will tell us exactly what they need. It's not a mystery. But we can't stop there. Long-term mobility requires the scaffolding that allows people to grow. That includes career pathways, skills training, mental health supports, access to childcare, and employers who understand the realities of today's labor market. In community-based employment services, we see every day how confidence, identity, and a sense of belonging are just as crucial as anything in job placement. They aren't soft outcomes they are the foundation that make the long-term progress possible. So to make these approaches stick, we need alignment at 3 levels. At the practice level, we need trauma-informed, person-centered service delivery that gives practitioners permission to meet people where they're at. That means flexibility, holistic assessments, the right staffing ratios so practitioners can truly build relationships, not just complete forms. At the organizational level, we need stable, predictable funding that allows agencies to offer wraparound supports, invest in staffing, and sustain community partnerships. Community-based providers already act as economic first responders, but they can only do that when the funding model recognizes the real cost of services. And at the policy level, we need procurement and agreements that acknowledge the actual conditions people are living in: income inadequacy, transportation barriers, rural and remote realities, and the importance of relational work. We need policy that values outcomes beyond immediate placements, metrics like attachment, belonging, skill development, and confidence that reflect the person's true journey. We have to balance urgency with aspiration, and people deserve both immediate stability and a future they can envision. So at community-based employment service providers, which is the realm that I come from, they're already doing that work. We just need the policy environment to catch up to what is happening on the ground.
Thank you so much, Janet, for kicking us off. Tristram.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful to just start by saying a little bit about what this decent work idea is, because if you've not come across it, I mean, it might just sound like a sort of platitude that we say, oh, it'd be nice if everyone had a lovely job. And actually, decent work is a kind of technical term that's used by organizations like the UN and the International Labour Organization. And it means a number of specific things. So the kind of things that it means is that jobs should give you enough to live on, that you should have some right to take holiday, you should have some autonomy about your working life. So, you know, some decisions about what tasks you do, some possibility to decide when you work and so on. That it should give you access to healthcare, there should be safety at work and so on. So it's a set of things which are, I would say, like relatively minimal demands about what working lives should offer people. In reality, of course, we know that many people's working lives don't meet that standard. You know, even in the global north, where you know, you might assume that people are doing better. So I think the first thing that we can do as career development professionals is help people to understand that there is this idea of decent work, that it's not a sort of pie in the sky dream, that you should be able to have some sort of decent life, and that if you work hard, that you should get rewarded for that work hard with these kinds of basic standards of living. So I think the first thing is to let people know that that's something that they can and should expect, and that they should be looking for that in work, or they at least should consider looking for that in work, and help them to plot a pathway from badder forms of work to better forms of work. I think we can go a bit further than that as well. I think we can also help people to think about how they might put pressure on organizations that are employing them, or that they're already employed by. So how, for example, can we get a bad employer to become a better employer? It's not a fixed thing. Employers can improve the amount they pay you. They can give you more autonomy. These are not impossible dreams. And that's about talking about things like, well, how do you advocate for yourself at work? You know, what would you think about joining something like a trade union, for example, and so on. And I think ultimately there's a role for both us and our clients to represent this to policy and to say, well, look, if we're trying to work with people, either young people or adults, perhaps unemployed adults, and engage them in the working world, and get people to contribute to society through their work should give them something back. and we should be really arguing for that, I think. So I think if we think about decent work, it can be a very useful concept for us to mobilize in the context of career development work.
Thank you, Tristram. You just heard two amazing perspectives from our panelists, with Janet talking about the alignment and understanding, if we're able to ask people what they want and what they need, part of advocate for themselves and seeing how we can support around that. And ultimately, for everybody to understand that decent work it's a human right. It's something to be expected rather than, to wish for something to happen. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Janet talked about the idea that people don't have to tell their stories over and over again because it can be traumatizing. So that leads us into the next theme, where we're going to talk about integrated career and mental health support. So inviting Sharon and Shelby to come and talk. And thank you for already turning on your cameras. Yes. What does a truly trauma-informed employment service look like in terms of intakes, then caseload, supervision, handoffs, and what funding and accountability changes should we advocate to sustain it? Sharon. Oh, Sharon, you're muted. Has to happen once in a panel, right?
Sorry. So I think it begins with the guiding premise that a trauma-informed employment service recognizes that many clients bring histories of interpersonal, community, structural trauma, which shapes their readiness for work. So that has to be considered initially. It also impacts how the client will respond to an assessment, and certainly their ability to sustain employment. Now, a truly trauma-informed design shifts away from what is wrong with the person, the client, the employee, to what happened to them. And that will embed more safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and certainly empowerment across every contact point. Let's think about the intake. I think three things are really important with the intake. The intake should be safe. The client should experience emotional safety, and we have to be really careful that we do not re-injure the client in any way. It should be flexible and strength-based, because many people who have experienced trauma are always focusing on areas that they need to develop versus their strength. I think it would be good if we could use maybe perhaps a very brief, but some sort of validated screening to identify trauma exposure as well as the current risks. The intake process must assess social determinants that are happening, like housing, food insecurity, childcare. And then if we think about the caseload perhaps should be smaller, particularly for clients who have more intensive needs, like significant trauma exposure, active mental health symptoms, substance abuse. I think that they would receive a higher quality of care if they were on a smaller caseload. I think a team-based model works really well, where they have access to an interdisciplinary team, where you have behavioral health, you have career counselors and practitioners, as well as peer support. And thinking about supervision is so important at no matter what stage we're in terms of our career. And that should probably happen weekly or bi-weekly. And that can include consultation, reflective space, but certainly risk management. Now, thinking about a warm handoff and cross-system navigations, we're looking at how does the practitioner contact maybe a service or another provider to actually co-treat, to actually share what the immediate needs and safety concerns might be for that particular client. That may involve even entering into some memorandum of understanding with another agency, collaboration that can accompany clients throughout a multi-system process. And finally, in terms of funding, short-term funding and high targets certainly undermine relational care. And so if we want services that are going to be durable, that are going to be humane, we have to change what we pay for, and we have to hold programs accountable. So ways that we can advocate are perhaps for more multi-year outcome flexible options, maybe 3 to 5 year cycles. And this allows time to build relationships, measure outcomes, allow flexible use of funds, braided maybe in blended funding models. And then finally, what about trauma-informed grant making, which means simpler applications, longer reporting timelines, fewer restricted paying for startup and core operating costs.
Absolutely. I could not agree more with what you said, Dr. Givens. I think on that last note, I was just thinking about lack of alignment, right? A lot of times I see programs aligning to certain metrics or funding outcomes over what they know are the needs of the clients or the students. So that just brought that to the front of my mind. But I couldn't agree with more with everything you said. And you also mentioned interdisciplinary teams, which I think is beautiful. And I want to thank all the career development practitioners tuning in today. And something I really love about our field is that it is robust, and I think becoming more robust, with career counselors, career development folks with doctorate degrees, career coaches and advisors, career development professionals of all types. And I think that's a really amazing thing that makes our field so strong. And I think when we put that into the hands of policymakers who make decisions based on short-term solutions and spending as little as possible, I think there are negative consequences, like centers that don't have teams that include the different types of career practitioners with the different scopes of practice. And, I'm going to dream and pie in the sky kind of a little bit here to take Tristram's word, but I think it would be amazing if every single career development service had a multitude of both interdisciplinary practitioners and folks in the career development space with different scopes of practice, right? Because I could see myself really well working with these different folks and doing warm handoffs even within the career services. So I think that's just a huge thing, because I do think, unfortunately, on the policy side, sometimes it just comes down to profit margins and us as the cost of labor. And, we want career development practitioners to be paid for what they're worth as well. So it's kind of this multifaceted thing where if we're advocating for decent work for our clients, we also want to advocate it for ourselves. And I've seen centers, that don't have a career counselor on staff. And I do think that's not trauma informed, because although I think there are amazing practitioners out there, part of the counseling curriculum is really getting that deeper dive into trauma and informed care, which I think Dr. Givens put in great detail, right? You could hear the amount of thought and care that comes from that and the training that comes in that. And then I agree 100% on caseloads being manageable and it depending on the needs of the clients and the students. Overall, in terms of funding, I want to just talk about that as well. With the multi-year piece, you're right, hitting the nail on the head, Dr. Givens. But in addition, I'm part of the National Career Development Association Government Relations Committee. And when we went to the Hill to talk to folks in Washington, D.C., we gave them a takeaway, a little handout that they could keep with them. And on it, it had a statistic of spending on career guidance of OECD countries, and it compared us to all these other economic development corporation companies and countries. US was the last one, lowest percentage per GDP on career guidance. So it was basically us just kind of sharing that with our policymakers and saying, hey, here's where we are compared to other nations, right? Don't we want to provide our citizens with quality, trauma-informed career guidance? Isn't that going to stimulate our economy? Isn't that going to lead to growth that we want to see? So I think that kind of advocacy can make a difference too, is just cross-country comparison and looking at spending and being honest and saying, hey, we're doing this short-term spending, or we're not even spending high amounts compared to other nations. And then lastly, just that trauma-informed employment services, I think, need to be accountable for their communities by really looking at what success metrics they're utilizing. Of course, we have to align it with grant funding or whatever the metrics at place already are, but the people closest to the problems are the people closest to the solutions. So what metrics do they want us to use and be measuring by? And are we prioritizing those? Probably, because we're helpers, but are we also including that and reflecting that back to the policymakers and the grant competitions and saying, hey, these are metrics we also measured by that we should be measuring by. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shelby and Sharon. Wow. And again, lots of insights here. I really, think about the language is shifting what is wrong and what happened to them. And it goes back to what the previous panelists talked about. It's looking at the systemic barriers and so what's happening to our people overall. And we have the personal insights to see this as we see individual clients, or we're looking at this in groups as well. Both of your responses make me think about the idea of silos, and silos are containers that hold grain. They're good for holding grain, not so good for holding people, right? So how do we work better together? And once again, the idea of multi-year funding and opportunities is coming up in the 4 people that we've heard from so far. So the question I'm holding in my mind is, how do we help our funders reimagine these opportunities in a way, feed 2 birds with 1 stone, that better serve our clients and also help them meet their objectives. So that's, next time, Shelby, the pamphlet you hand out is, US is doing better, and here's what else we can be doing. Thank you for that. Okay, on to the next theme: artificial intelligence, automation, digital equity. I'm going to invite Tristram and Wendy to come and share their perspectives with us. And here's the question: what guardrails should the sector demand for AI tools in assessments, matching, and screening? So bias audits, and transparency. And how should we press vendors, employers, and funders to adopt them? Tristram, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think quite a lot of things would be I suppose I'm increasingly falling into the category of being a bit of an AI skeptic. I'm somebody who's done a lot of work over the years on the value of digital tools in career guidance. I think it's very, very important that we engage with new technologies and bring them in and so on. I think the thing that worries me about AI as it's currently, I think there's a few things. One is the ownership of AI. Who owns it? What purpose are they using it for? The second is data. Where is our data going? What's happening with it? And then the third thing is transparency. What AI tools? Something like ChatGPT is very good at giving you something that looks like sense, but it doesn't necessarily always mean that it is sense. And as a field, we've spent a long time developing a lot of sort of scientific tools for doing things like career assessment. Now, I can be skeptical of some of those, even so, but at least there is some transparency if you're using an assessment tool that's got some kind of psychometric behind it. We can look at how we feel about that, what is it actually measuring, and so on. So I think there's lots of reasons to be very careful. I think there's also lots of reasons to be skeptical about the level of hype that's going on with AI, that we're being told that this is the solution to every problem, before we're being told really what the problems are. That doesn't mean I think there's no use cases for it, but I think, to be honest, my argument here would be that we should slow down and think very carefully about what problems AI is solving for us before we rush headlong into it, and particularly pay attention to these issues of what are we giving up in terms of control over data and ethics and all of these sorts of things. So I think we need to advance slowly and cautiously and critically in relation to AI.
Thank you, Tristram. Wendy.
So I don't disagree with what Tristram says. We need responsible AI frameworks. But listening to the conversation, what I would be concerned about if I were a career counselor and not working in a business faculty, and in fact, I'm joining you from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce's Ontario Economic Summit, is career counselors, I think, are supposed to get people jobs. And so what I would be focusing on in this conversation around AI is how can you use AI to help people get jobs? How can you yourself be equipped with the skills, either individually or in your organization, to many of the problems that were identified, for example, having to repeat stories, repeat information, fragmentation within the system, and frankly, lack of outcomes in terms of the bottom line, which is, are you getting people jobs, can be enabled by artificial intelligence. And we're seeing a lot as we move towards, for example, agentic AI. Medical schools now have created effectively trainers for medical students that are basically AI agents. So think about it. If medical schools can develop AI agents that they can replicate to make sure that medical students get customized training in the form that they want and need, etc., we're not very far from the notion of agentic career counselors. And I would be preoccupied personally, if I were in the sector, in trying to understand what it is employers want and need, what are the skills that are going to be required to get those jobs, and how can I be deploying technology effectively rather than imagining that I'm in a position to tell employers what they should and shouldn't do with respect to AI. And that isn't to say that there aren't important conversations about things like data sovereignty and so on, but I do rather feel, we've done quite a lot of research on this through the Future Skills Center, but also through our work with immigrant serving organizations in particular. I do really feel that all of us need to center accountability and outcomes in a serious way, because I just don't think it's realistic to be going to government and saying we need more. I think we have to be figuring out how we can be more effective. And that's at all levels, K to 12, post-secondary, immigrant serving organizations, the whole spectrum of people whose role is supposed to be to help people prepare for jobs.
Thank you so much, Wendy and Tristram. Wow, really interesting discussion here, and really appreciate both of your perspective here. What I'm hearing from both is there's, of course, opportunities to leverage AI, and for career development professionals to understand what are the implications that have for the work that we do. How does it elevate our profession and the work that we do, while at the same time keeping that skepticism intact, right? There's where's the data going? How can we use it responsibly? So the responsible AI frameworks, and this comes up in every AI sessions that I've been part of. The idea of responsibility also means looking at the environmental impact when we're using generative AI as well. So really like Tristram, your question, what problems do we believe AI is solving for us? And answering that question is going to help give us guidance and directions on how to move forward and using AI responsibly in our field, and inspiring others to do the same. Thank you. Okay, so the next question we have is youth and long-term unemployment. How should we define and track progress for youth and long-term unemployed folks beyond immediate placement? So attachment, confidence, identity, belonging, and what changes to contracts, reporting, and program design should we advocate to recognize it? So Shelby, go ahead, and then I'll forward to Janet.
Absolutely. And Wendy, I really appreciate your perspective because I think sometimes we get really in our lens. And, I don't always have that business side or that government side. So I always appreciate those, feedback and critiques. And when I was preparing for this question, it's funny because I came up, if y'all have been familiar with the concept of freedom dreaming, which is, letting ourselves envision and imagine the future without being held back by constraints. And there's, we obviously have to think through constraints and realities. But I kind of was like, yeah, let's freedom dream for a minute. I just want you all to imagine a career services space or center that measures its success based on three key things. One would be the percentage of students or clients that are able to secure sustainable, well-paid employment that they feel confident is aligned with their interests, values, strengths, and needs and circumstances. So that's, one major one. The second one would be students and clients' agency and confidence in their ability to navigate future career decisions and the inevitable disruptions that we know are going to come from the future, AI and automation, climate change and our changing planet, who knows what else. And then third, I do think training employers to improve their policies and practices to be student and client ready, rather than exclusively training students and clients to be workforce ready. I do think it has to be a both and. And I'm like echoing in my head is what Wendy said about like, are we in a position to be telling employers what to do or telling governments what to do? And I think that's part of uplifting our client's voice, is to kind of see the power that we do have and see what we can make progress in, and really prioritize working with the employers that really are aligned in providing trauma-informed spaces, in providing spaces where our clients and students will have a sense of belonging and a sense of agency. So I'm just curious, if contracts and grants reports and programs were measured based on those three metrics, what would we see in the work landscape, right? Would it lead to systemic change because people are more aligned and fulfilled? I would like to think so. I don't know. But that's something to think about. In terms of long-term unemployment, I have worked with too many long-term unemployed folks who are kind of doing everything right or doing a lot of stuff right. And so they just get worn down by the process. And that's why I come back to like using our voice and agency and positionality to try to help employers learn to be a little more client and student ready. And I'm already seeing that. I've seen shifts in employers, even just in my time in the field, where there's been progress to not fixating so much on gaps in employment. I was recently at a panel where an employer came up and said, I value lived experience. That's what I look for the most in my interviews. I'm not looking at traditional degrees and metrics. I am looking at someone who has been through things and can communicate about that effectively, and it informs their work and makes them a more well-rounded, holistically prepared individual. And I was like, oh, I want to work with that employer. I want to help that employer get the workforce they want, because I'm in the community college sector and I have so many students that have incredible work experience, that some incredible lived experience that sometimes leads them to not have as many of the traditional metrics of a certificate or associate degree, or they're on their way to that. So when it comes to youth and long-term unemployment, I really think what we need to prioritize is alignment. We need to prioritize skill building and navigational skills, because we know they're going to move on, and then the world is still going to change and they'll still have to adapt. And I really do think we have to partner with employers and hear where they're coming from and hear their pain points, but also make sure they understand and remember that lived experience of the client side, the student side.
Thank you, Shelby. Janet.
Wow, Shelby, really great, really great. And I love the perspective that you bring to it. It's interesting because one of the things that occurs to me is the labor market that the youth are entering today, and those that have been unemployed for a long time, is very different than the ones their parents entered. And I was at a Labor Market Information Council, that's an organization in Canada, where they're talking about the labor market. And essentially normally it's a pyramid, right? At the top, you've got the high level jobs, you've got medium level jobs, and usually a lot of entry level jobs. But the current labor market in Canada, and I think globally as well, is that we're more of a diamond. There's not really the entry level or the entry level jobs that were out there before. And that is having a huge hit to youth and those that are long-term unemployed, in that we're dealing with a different set of cards, and I think a few of them are missing. So that is the challenge, right? So we're watching in this digital environment that we're in, youth and long-term unemployed people sending out hundreds and hundreds of online applications, often through automated portals, never hearing back, never making it through resume sorting technology. And the career development professionals, we know that there's phantom jobs out there. And we know that there are algorithms that are sorting and filtering people out of employment. So when we look at system measures of success only by placements, we are judging people on a process that is stacked against them from the start. And we're also seeing the long tail of the pandemic, especially for youth entering the workforce, many of whom missed their first work experiences, the part-time jobs, the volunteering, the early workplace exposure that traditionally build those employability skills that they rely on for the rest of their careers. And without those early social and workplace cues, it's harder for youth to feel confident, grounded, able to see themselves in the labor market. Their sense of connection, identity, purpose, and direction often gets lost in the shuttle to the detriment of our local and national economies. This is a huge problem. So the question then becomes like, how should we define and track progress in ways that reflect the reality that youth are living in, not the system we wish they were in? And so progress for youth and long-term unemployment should include attachment and engagement. Are they showing up more regularly? Are they staying connected to a caring adult or a program? Confidence in self-efficacy. Do they believe that they can succeed? Are they willing to try something new? Identity and purpose. Are they discovering what matters to them, what they're good at, where they fit? And then belonging. Do they feel part of a community? If you're working online on your job search and you don't know that there are resources out there for you, you're going to feel disconnected to everything, and you're going to be going through the spiral of that dark rabbit hole by yourself without the support of those around you. And these are not soft outcomes. The outcomes I'm mentioning, these are foundational. And without these placements, job placements, the foundations rarely stick. You really need to have that. So to make this matter, our contracts, reporting systems, and our program designs must evolve as Shelby says, and the employers and their wants and needs must evolve. So, for example, contract language that recognizes developmental outcomes, not just employment outcomes, is important. Reporting frameworks that track indicators like stability, engagement, learning, and well-being, so that the journey counts, not just the destination. And as Shelby says, skill building and navigational skills, because they're going to need that now more than ever. And that's the scaffolding for the future. If we want, we need program design that funds time, trust building, and relational work. And because the connection, not compliance, is what re-engages youth. So if we want young people to thrive, we need a funding and accountability system that values the real work, human connection, identity building, and meaningful progress. And I was listening to Serena Hopkins at our conference from CCDF, and she talked about the rise of neoliberalism, and it's the cost per person is you've got to make a business case for it. And it's the business case is to spend more money and to take more time.
Thank you. So much nuggets from there. And the phrase that's in my head is we can no longer operate with the 1-year funding cycle and model, because if we want these things, confidence, engagement, sense of belonging, and all of those are connected to career development. And I know that, I'm preaching to the crowd here. like Janet said, these are not soft outcomes. And as Shelby said, we need to better align and think about that. So multi-year funding, here we're at it again, and recognizing that we're at different times than from previous generation. What are we going to do to ensure that future generations can thrive? Okay, that brings us to our last theme on inclusive entrepreneurship and skills ecosystem. How can CDPs integrate entrepreneurship pathways, so side gigs, co-ops, social enterprises, into career plans without pushing people into precarious work? So a full circle back to the decent work idea. And what partnerships and policy shifts should we push to make it a safe and viable option? Wendy.
Well, I'm smiling because, again, the notion that entrepreneurial pathways, I teach an entrepreneurship program, are precarious is, to me, a flipping of the script. If you look at the foundational skills for success, you've got the reading, writing, and arithmetic. Increasingly, there's focus on social and emotional intelligence. But what's coming out, not just domestically, but internationally, are things like creativity and innovation, adaptability, critical thinking. Well, guess what? Those are entrepreneurial skills. So I think that, I would actually, again, challenge some of the assumptions that underpin the question, because I would argue that entrepreneurial skills are actually very connected to everything you're talking about that will position youth to be successful in the future. I mean, one of the things we saw with the latest Pew data was youth not showing the same level of I forget what the word was, engagement effectively with reliability. It had to do with commitment to work and so on. And part of that is a function of all the things people have talked about in terms of creating good work environments and so on. But a lot of people choose to work for themselves. It's not that they're always excluded and so they become precarious. And I would actually argue that the experience of, running a lemonade stand or doing some very, the summer company program, for example, in the province of Ontario, develop skills that are directly related to career success. And we can show that. So again, I wouldn't think that providing entrepreneurial skills or knowledge of business or figuring out how to create your own job is something that is pushing people into precarity. I think it's actually pushing them into long-term success, whether they end up working for a large organization, an NGO, government, or for themselves.
Thank you, Wendy. Sharon.
Yeah, and I really like this question because I think it's personal to me as well, because I remember starting a private practice but didn't realize that I'm now an entrepreneur as well. And so I think one of the things that Wendy said that stands out is that when we seek an entrepreneurial pathway, we can build transferable skills or grow a lot of essential skills that we already have. And entrepreneurship is a really good way to expand opportunity. But I do believe, particularly with contemporary gigs, that it also exhibits high levels of instability. And I think we have to be honest and talk with clients about that, because these are outcomes when we think about the levels of instability, like limited social protection and weak bargaining power. These are some of the outcomes that can reproduce labor market precariousness unless intervention is deliberately implemented, or we help build worker protections and institutional supports. So when I think about working with different clients, I like to begin with distinguishing pathways and risk assessing. So I may think about in the diagnostic process, what's the client's current or past relationship with risk? Would seeking entrepreneurship perhaps promote additional unhealthy behavior that demonstrates perhaps a lack of self-protection? I think that's important to think about the person in front of us and the level of precariousness that might bring about. So therefore, we're looking at assessing the client's goal. What about their household risk tolerance, their baseline earning needs? If they're wanting to start a business where they're bringing in $2,000 a month, but their responsibilities are $4,000 a month. I like to use a decision-making matrix that we can put it on paper and have the person actually see it visually. Let's look at the numbers here. Let's look at what are we truly working with in terms of this venture, perhaps. I think as career development practitioners, and I'm not sure if I knew this early on, but I think it's important to teach business fundamentals to our clients or youth, plus worker protections and rights. I think it's our responsibility to know workers' rights, particularly in our state and also nationally, because many of the clients that we deal with are very vulnerable and they don't know or understand what rights they have. And as career development professionals, I think it's our responsibility to have that information and share that information with them. I think we can encourage earn while learning models, for example, that they can actually earn money while learning a task. They don't have to jump completely in fully to entrepreneurship. Then we want to embed some level of evaluation and credentialing, maybe credit or micro credentials that tie to demonstrated competency. So that will reduce the need for what? Unstable or trial work as a proof of capability. So I think there are some safeguards that career development professionals that we can promote, and that could be models that lack basic protections. They don't have any health insurance, no retirement, unless participants, for example, already have their coverage. I think that we have to maybe refer or offer financial planning modules, looking at what the cost of living is, how can they budget? These things are very important. And then looking at guarantee off ramps, like clear assisted pathways back to wage employment or training if self-employment fails. So one of the questions I like to ask what will you do if this doesn't work? What is your parachute here if this does not work out? And lastly, as career development professionals, we must push for laws that clarify employment classification and make it harder to misclassify employees as independent contractors. We have to advocate for those portable benefits, clear classification rules, co-op friendly legal forms, social procurement, and accessible social finance, because entrepreneurship will only be a non-precarious pathway when program design is embedded in worker-centered policies and institutional partnerships.
Thank you, Sharon. I know Tristram, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I really just want to say I really liked what Sharon just said. I thought that really, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. The point I wanted to make was I think sometimes when we talk about entrepreneurial skills, we're talking about two sort of packages of skills. And the first one I would say is a whole set of things which are around creativity, opportunity creation, and so on. And all of the spotting opportunities and so on. These things are equally useful within organizations and within employment as they are outside. And then there's another set of skills which are about setting up businesses, managing self-employment, And exactly as Sharon says, I think these are also important things. I think both of those packages of skills are important things for us to deal with in career development, and educating people on both of those do not drive them towards precarious pathways. But that doesn't mean that there aren't precarious pathways out there. And it doesn't mean that lots of people who are self-employed, I mean, I don't know the data in the States, but in the UK, self-employed people earn less on average than employed people, and are more likely to be in forms of precarious work, less likely to have the forms of social protection that Sharon talked about, and so on. Now, as long as people are aware of that and they understand that risk and they move into it, and also we skill them up to manage those things, that's not necessarily a problem. But I think we need to be careful about sort of valorizing kind of entrepreneurship as being the solution to everyone's problems. It's great for some people to do it. I think we should all learn more about it, but it's not the answer for everyone.
Thanks for that. Again, appreciate all the panelists for their perspective. And Wendy, I wanted to comment with you. I think if I weren't that co-op student that understood the power of my experience, I don't think I'd be here speaking with you all today. So for me, the reflection I got from your perspective is, how do we close that skills awareness gap? Because many times we don't come back with the reflection that we need to think about the next step in our development. And then Sharon and Tristram talking about that awareness of the risk of entrepreneurship, but knowing it's risk and reality. And then Sharon, I love that decision matrix, because you're still giving them the agency while helping them understand their context so that they can make those informed career choices. So it's about, what can we do to embed support around people that are making these decisions? Okay, so we've got 5 more minutes here, and I've asked the panelists to be as concise as they can, because this is the making advocacy stick. What are we going to do about this? So they get their choice of one either question. What is one idea, one data point, lived experience story that has shifted a decision for you, the panelists? And how can CDPs build that pairing into their context? Or they could also answer, how should the sector track outcomes? And I think some of you have already talked about that as well. So evidence translates into sustained funding rather than one-off. So Janet, start us off.
I love this question. Thank you so much, Candy. So for me, the most powerful advocacy happens when data and lived experience come together. But it also means being willing to question the data that doesn't match what you see on the ground. I always say our career development professionals are the experts, and they inform the programs because they are seeing it firsthand. So a good example of this in British Columbia is we have in Canada, we have the Skills for Success program, which is a pre-employability skill building, and it's basics such as like reading, writing, communication to prepare people for employment. So when the government data came out, it showed that the community-based service providers in BC were not teaching this. And so government said, okay, well, if you teach this, we'll give you more money for the outcomes. And it seemed to me it was really strange, because I knew that our employment service providers were doing this. But what we found out with conversations with government is that there was an applet on the billing portal that wasn't working. And so the career development professionals were still still training skills for success, but the data wasn't being collected by government on the other end. And so their perception was it wasn't being done at all. And it was just so interesting to come together and realize, is it just an applet and all of this data that you had isn't correct? That was quite shocking to me, but of course, easily remedied. Because I don't want to take up too much more time, but I think that the work that's being done on the ground, there's opportunities to inform programs and policies, and you have the credibility of the lived experiences. You are advocating for your clients, and that's a really important piece of information. I work with government and funders and programmers, program managers, in collaboration. We're not activists, we're there because we all want the same thing. We want a thriving labor market. We want people to access meaningful and decent work. And sometimes when a policy decision's made, it's always made with the best intentions, but what happens on the ground is not always what is expected. And I see my job is to help carry water for those experts on the ground and take it to government and just make sure that the feedback loop is closed.
Thanks, Janet. Shelby.
Couldn't agree more with what was said. I just wanted to add one other kind of outcome that you can bring to your tracking and your metrics, and that's liberatory outcomes. Dr. Gina Ann Garcia is one of the ones I know who speaks about this a lot, and I'll make sure one of her articles get posted in the chat. But in the community college sector, we're of course tracking graduation rates, ability to attain a job after graduation, living wage. These are crucial outcomes, obviously. In addition to that, some liberatory outcomes she mentions are civic engagement, social agency, identity development and leadership development, critical consciousness building. And we've spoken about these, I think, in different ways throughout this panel, but I have started tracking these in my career development classes and seeing if students through my pre and post assessment are, able to expand. And even those who end up not passing the class because they aren't able to make the time to submit the homework or show up every time, have demonstrated growth in those liberatory outcomes. And I take that as not a full success. Obviously, I want them to meet the traditional outcomes as well, but I still take that as a success and as a, hey, they kept showing up and they knew they weren't going to pass and they kept showing up. So they're getting something out of this. And I think the harder part that Janet was mentioning is how do we close that loop? How do we make sure policymakers and people in power recognize the value of different types of outcomes while of course still holding us accountable to the traditional outcomes? I don't want to forget about that. And I don't want to feel naive and say those aren't important. But it's both. And we have to be thinking about it on the individual level of the work we're doing and the systemic level. And I know that's a lot. And I'm not telling everybody tuning in today to do more on top of what you're already doing. I'm just inviting you to think about different ways to do it, to think about different ways that you could uplift what's happening systemically. And just like Janet said, close that loop in new ways. Maybe it's as simple as there was an applet that people didn't see. I think that's such a perfect example of how sometimes, like I said, people are in their own lenses. I think sometimes in certain positions of power and policy, we don't see some of the outcomes and the benefits that do come from metrics we aren't already tracking. So I just think really collecting that data and really uplifting it is crucial and a real concrete advocacy strategy to employ.
We've got 3 more minutes left. I'm going to turn to Wendy.
I guess I would say 2 things. One is we've done a lot of research on the predictors of long-term unemployment, and it's very much tied to mental health. So making sure mental health professionals are actively engaged in the process is really critical. And the only other thing I would say, and this comes out of trying to deal with the backlash against equity, diversity, and inclusion, is there was a Indigenous elder who said, I learned early on that to hunt bear, I had to learn to think like a bear. And what I would say is there is a big risk for many professional groups talking to each other about the things that you all share and believe is not necessarily going to change the minds of people who don't think the same way you do. And if you look at the current, at least at the federal level, the current environment, the priorities, what's happening in the budget, all I would suggest is whatever messaging and whatever messengers you put forth, you think about the audience, because what I've heard today doesn't give me a lot of confidence that you will be successful in making change.
Thank you very much. Tristram.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on this data point and gathering outcomes and so on. And in a way, I'll put a kind of right. So I'm a researcher, and so everything I've ever written ends with the phrase "more research is necessary" and more data is necessary, and so on. So I'm not saying we don't need more data and we don't need more research and so on. But I am a bit skeptical of the idea that everybody in the world should be collecting endless data on everything that they do. we actually know quite a lot about how career development works. We know what the predictors of success are. We know that interventions, career guidance and careers education interventions are effective. We've got quite a lot of data and evidence that that speaks to that. Now, I would like better evidence and better, better data and so on. I don't think that's necessarily achieved by tying every practitioner down with the idea of collecting endless data. I think there's two things. I think we need firstly to be better at represent. I mean, it's kind of what Wendy said. We need to be better at representing what the evidence base that we stand on is, and putting it into frames that are appealing to policymakers. So, we've done lots of things on the economic benefits of career guidance and things that tie to particular social agendas that the government are working on at this particular time, and so on. So I think the first thing is about selling, essentially. I think the second thing is about strategic engagement with the evidence base and making decisions about where we really do need better evidence, and then making sure we gather that. Because I just worry that going down this kind of collecting data all the time leads people down the route where you say, we're going to pay people by results and so on. And we've been down those roads quite a lot in the UK, and they don't end well. They end up with very reduced kind of visions of what outcomes what are constituted by outcomes and so on. So I just think we should be a bit skeptical by always saying collect more data, collect more evidence.
Hey, Sharon, bring us home. You've got the final minute before the tech kicks us off. And thank you, everyone.
I think I wanted to just kind of add a little bit more from the entrepreneur piece, because when I came across some data, and it was a 2019 International Labor Organization study that said 61% of the global workforce operates in the informal economy and without access to some of the basic protections. And I think what really connected for me was what an actual client that I have that I will call Marie, who was laid off and started doing Uber Eats and short-term consulting, and was exhausted, uninsured, and had no stable childcare. So that moment, though, when I started looking at what data was out there and thinking about my client, it reframed my role as a practitioner, in the sense that we realize that data must not only describe conditions, but it has to compel design. And I think we're at a point now where everybody's raving about the gig economy, where we need to do even more research, but making sure that in that research that we're looking heavily at what protections are available for our client. How do we promote that, and how do we advocate more for protections and laws for our clients? For my client, Marie, can she have flexibility and stability?
Thank you very much, Sharon. I'm going to pass it back to Melissa for a close, but thank you so much for the panelists and for all of you for joining us.
This concludes our live virtual event for North America Career Week. We would like to thank Dr. Ho and all of our panelists for participating in this virtual event, and thank you all for attending. Have a great day.